All right, I said last week we were going to take a short interlude in between, we're about halfway done with Jeremiah. And that interlude is going to come from Matthew chapter 6, where we're going to study what's sometimes called the Lord's Prayer, but probably more properly called the model prayer or the disciples' prayer. And, the Bible tells us that it's incredibly important that we pray. We're commanded to pray. We're commanded to pray without ceasing. We're to be prayerful people. And so in this study, that's what we're going to look at, is the fact that men ought always to pray. And we want to look at what Jesus emphasized in that prayer and why it's so important for us to look at it, to see what it tells us, because we're not supposed to be shy in our prayers. We're supposed to, have boldness, the Bible says, in coming to God. So that's what we want to do. Prayer, changes things. That's what prayer does. When we look at James chapter 5, we see that by inspiration, James says that prayer changes things. If you go to James chapter 5, verse 16, would someone read that? James 5:16.
Therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. The effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much.
Can accomplish much. Can accomplish much. Prayer changes things. That's what he says. Prayer changes things. And that's what we want to look at. We want to examine this prayer. We want to look at it in a lot of different ways, because prayer is a very powerful tool. It's an avenue of worship. It's how we communicate with God. We communicate with God through prayer. And so we want to make sure that we are doing what God wants us to do. So when we look at this prayer in Matthew chapter 6, we'll notice that before he gets into saying, "In this manner therefore pray," he instructs us in some things about our attitude and our spirit in praying that is very important as well. So in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 5, we're going to read down to verse 8, because this is the prelude to Jesus telling his disciples how to pray. He says, "And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, the pretenders. For they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who's in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Therefore do not be like them. For your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask Him." There's at least 3 different things here, topics that he addresses, that he wants his disciples to avoid. Because if you end up doing like these, as he calls them, hypocrites or pretenders, then your prayers are completely ineffective. They have no possibility of accomplishing anything. The first thing he says is about, don't be like hypocrites, because they love to pray standing in synagogues and on the corners to be seen by men. So the first thing is about the choice of where you pray. What did these Pharisees want to do? Well, they wanted to be in the most visible places. I mean, in the synagogues and in the corners of the street would be the places where most people would see them. So that's why he says that's what the Pharisees like to do. They enjoyed doing that. I mean, those were the most public places. The Pharisees and the Jewish people for many, many years, for centuries, had some set times for prayer. You know, that they would pray at this time and at that time and at that time. Let's see. Let's go to Daniel chapter 6. We'll look at what Daniel did. This is just one example. Daniel chapter 6. And we'll go down to verse 10. So if someone would read Daniel chapter 6, verse 10.
Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days.
Okay, that was his normal pattern, his normal routine, was to at least, all right, this was like the minimum, pray 3 times a day, where he would open the window and pray toward Jerusalem. And of course, that was where the temple was, and of course, by the time of Daniel, or at about this time, that temple had already been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. But he did this 3 times a day. And so that was his usual custom. King David said that he had normal times when he would, sit down and pray. So it was a normal thing for Jews to do this, to pray at certain times of the day. It was like set times. By the time the New Testament came around, Jews would pray early in the morning at the time of the morning sacrifice, in the afternoon about 3 o'clock, and in the evening at sunset. And so if a Pharisee would be on the corner of a street during any of those times, he would stop and pray. The whole point that Jesus is making here, though, is, did he plan it so he would be at the street corner at that time so people would see him? Or was it that was just the time that he happened to be there? See, it was all about attitude. Did he plan it so he would be there so people would see him praying? Or did he just happen to be at that place, at sunset or whenever? So it was all about what was their intention. That's why he calls them hypocrites. Some of them pretended to be religious, very spiritual, and so they would plan on being in open places so people would see them praying. So it goes back to attitude, it goes back to their spirit, and whether they wanted to be showy and pretentious. That's what he is showing here was a great temptation for them. And I didn't realize this, but back during the days of like Christopher Columbus, there were set times that the people on those 3 ships would pray, and they were very strict about it. And I didn't know that until I was reading this week. So it was a very common thing for people at that time. Of course, they were, that was during the days of when Spain kind of ruled the world, and of course Spain was a very Catholic nation. And they had set times for praying. They had times when they would sing some of the psalms on board those ships. The reason they did this is they thought that would promote, the right spirit and camaraderie on the boats as they would sail. Jesus said, don't do things to sound a trumpet. Don't draw attention to yourself. That's what he's wanting his disciples to know. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't do things so that it will make people look at you. That's not what praying is to be about. That's not what worship is to be about. You're supposed to be genuine. You're supposed to be sincere. You're not to be hypocritical or pretentious when you're praying. Jesus isn't condemning praying in public. You know, I know one Christian says you shouldn't pray in public. You shouldn't pray in public ever. Well, that's not what Jesus is talking about here. Did Jesus ever pray publicly? Lots of times. So did His followers. So all you have to do is go to the New Testament and you'll see that Jesus is not condemning praying in public. Praying in public is great if you're doing it for the right reason. If you're doing it so that people will think you're religious or godly, then it's the wrong reason. If you're doing it for the right reason, it's a great thing. You know, Jesus prayed, remember when He fed the 5,000, when He fed the 3,000, He prayed publicly in front of all those thousands of people. And that wasn't a worship service. That was just praying for food. And so we have a great example that it is perfectly legitimate and something approved by God to pray for food publicly. It's fine to do that. But He is condemning praying so that people will hear you, so that people will think, wow, he's a very religious person. So it's more about attitude and motive than it is place.
I kind of picture the people he's talking about here, the Pharisees, when they do pray on the corner, that they really project their voice and become extremely loud.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I can see, praying in public, voice.
All right.
So just the people around you are hearing it.
Yeah, again, I think it was so they would be heard. I think that was the thing that He was condemning. And they wanted, so at least some of them, wanted to be heard. They wanted people to hear that. So again, they would think that they were very godly and spiritual and religious. Something else they did was use vain repetitions. Use vain repetitions in prayer. Some would be very, what do you want to say? They would repeat things over and over again to make their prayers long. And again, so people, again, it's all about motive. They were wanting people to hear what they were saying. You know, they were supposed to, the Shema, what they, and the Jews still today say that prayer, Deuteronomy chapter 6. They would say that over and over and over again. And by the time of the New Testament, they had added many other prayers to that list. In the Old Testament we have examples of pagans praying to their gods over and over again. Remember Elijah and the prophets of Baal? The prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel would pray over and over again. They were trying to get Baal to answer them. There was like a contest between Jehovah and Baal. And the prophets of Baal stood there. Remember, they cut themselves and did all kinds of things. And for hours, they repeatedly would go to Baal. Baal hear us, Baal hear us, Baal hear us. Never did. In the New Testament, Paul, remember the people saying, "Great is the Diana of the Ephesians," and they were calling out to her as their God. And they did that for hours, over and over and over again. Well, those were false gods, so they didn't even exist, so they couldn't answer them. So he's warning his disciples, don't just repeat things like it's some sort of magic formula where you can, by saying it 7 times, well, then God's going to hear you. But He's not going to hear you if you say it 6 times. It says don't just repeat things. And that can be a problem today, just repeating things over and over and over again. That's not what He wants us to do. He's not saying that repeating something is necessarily always sinful, because Jesus did that. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane? Let's go to Matthew 26 for just a moment. Again, we look at his example. And again, it goes back to motive. Matthew 26, verse 44. Matthew 26, verse 44. If someone would read that.
And he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words.
Saying the same words. Remember, he went and prayed to his Father. Said the same words. So there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with repeating those words. It's just, why are you repeating the words? It all goes back to motive and attitude again. Why are you repeating things? And of course, many religions today do a lot of repetitious prayer. The Islamic faith, they're very much into repetitive prayer, saying certain prayers certain times a day. The people will call them to prayer from the top of the minarets, and they have a special name. I don't remember what they're called, but and they're to pray, exactly the same words every time, and so that's part of their religion as well. So he's telling his followers, they think they'll be heard for their many words. Don't be like them. Many words. Many words. There's no need, as Jesus says here, to make a pretense of long prayers. Let's go to Mark chapter 12 for a moment. Mark chapter 12. And if we go down to verse 38, notice what he says in talking about the scribes. It says, beware of the scribes, this is verse 38, who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. For appearance sake, make long prayers. Yes?
Well, this verse talking about when it says vain repetition, is what vain means. It's for appearance sake.
Yeah. Just useless. There's not anything good about it. Some of you may remember these examples. This goes back to inauguration of John F. Kennedy. I was a little too young to remember that. But a Catholic cardinal, Cardinal Cushing, prayed for 17 minutes and 30 seconds. That's a pretty long prayer. But that doesn't hold a candle to 1932. At Democratic National Convention, was praying for the nomination of Franklin Roosevelt. Amy Semple McPherson, who's the founder of the Foursquare Gospel Church, prayed for 31 minutes and 10 seconds.
Well, during the Depression, they had a lot to pray for.
Apparently they did. So, Jesus says, don't be like them. Don't pray like the pagans. That's what he's telling them. Don't pray like the pagans. He says, do not be like them. Don't be like them. Don't make vain repetitions. Don't make long prayers. If you're doing it, again, it goes back to motive and attitude. If you're doing it just to be heard of men, just to make a name for yourself, just for appearance sake. Is that a comment, Danny?
Yeah, this is just my opinion. I've been around people that pray long prayers, and it just seems like to me that they're rehearsed.
Okay.
They're not coming from the heart. They're not spontaneous. It's a rehearsal.
That goes back to the motive, and it's all about motive and attitude. That's what he's getting at here.
I was in a Baptist church one time when I was a kid, and we had a preacher named L.D. Capel. And we had a man named Doodle Self. He was a deacon, and he'd always say the closing prayer. Well, he'd pray for like 30 minutes. And so one day, the preacher, LD, he asked his brother Self, will you close with prayer? And so he prayed for like 30 minutes. And he said, would you close us again? So he prayed for about 15 minutes. The third time, he prayed for about a minute. And he said, okay. He said, Brother Self, now that you're caught up on your praying, would you stay this way? And, so my brother Self come back to church.
Oh, no.
Anyway.
Oh, my. So, there's three things he talks about here that he wants his disciples not to become like the pagans, not to become like, idol worshipers and so forth, Don't pray publicly if the only reason you're doing it is so people will see you and praise you. Don't make long prayers if the reason you're doing it is for appearance sake. And don't make all these repetitions over and over and over again if you're doing it for appearance sake. So again, it's all about motive. It's all about attitude. It's all about the right spirit. That's what he is talking about here. And he ends up this little section saying, your Father knows the things you need of before you ask Him. He still wants us to ask. These things draw us closer to the Father. I mean, this is the way we communicate with God, is through prayer. So, He wants us to pray. He loves for us to pray. And so He is basically telling us that prayer draws us closer to God, makes us closer to God. Have a seat, Dean. So that's why it's so important. So when we start looking here in 2 weeks at the actual prayer itself, he tells them in this that in this manner, okay, he doesn't say repeat this word for word, but he says in this manner. There are things in this prayer, he says, that form a good outline, that form a good sketch of the type of things that you should include in prayers, that are good to include in prayers. Now, certain prayers are, just because a prayer doesn't include every single one of these things doesn't mean that it's a bad prayer. There are some specific prayers that you just pray for one thing and that's it. But in general, he says, this forms a good outline. This forms a good outline for the type of things to pray for, and things that are important. Things that are important. And then what we're going to look at this morning is that very first part, Our Father who art in heaven. That's what the sermon is going to be about. Our Father who art in heaven. So this is a very short prayer, really. I think there's 66 words, at least in the King James, and I think the New King James has 66. Some of them have a few less or a few more, but that's not many words. But again, he doesn't want us to just repeat these 66 words. It's a great example. It's a great pattern. It's a model. And it's the type of thing that he wants us to include in our prayers. So, Lord willing, in 2 weeks we're going to start delving into it in detail, and probably be studying it a good part of the summer on Sunday morning before we get back into Jeremiah. Well, thanks for your participation this morning, and we'll, like I said, Lord willing, in a couple of weeks we'll get into that.